This is our First Baptist Church midweek podcast. We're live streaming to you on our YouTube channel. We're glad that you're here to join us. I'm here with my good friend, Teek Hamilton.
Hi, Jerry.
Hi, Teek. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm really good.
Well, good. You do seem rather chipper today.
It's a good day. It's nice outside. It's pretty. I liked it.
Wednesdays are fun to get up for, and it's a fun day all the way. It's a long day. But
They're easy to go to bed after.
yes, so I think so. It may be the most strenuous day that we have of the week.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah,
we got podcasting all the way through, dealing with students and children and adults and all that.
Yeah. So we start strong and finish strong. Hope you can do the same. Thanks for joining us, and let's talk about what's going on here.
So we finished up this week. We finished up the One Thing series, and we're going into another one. We won't hit that yet, but you talked about several things in there. Did you want to highlight any of that real quick before we go back into it, or just get into the questions I had? Because I had some.
I'm glad you did. We can go either way with that. As far as finishing up the series, it's always interesting the things that you learn when you give a certain text or a series of text a particular theme, and as you kind of work through that on a regular basis, a daily basis in my case, it's interesting the things that your takeaways from that. Mm-hmm. And again, we've already hit on this, but just to say once again, it is interesting how when we look into Scripture as far as how it can help us live life, that there are really good patterns in there of cycles of events and things that I think that we see that really help us. And so Paul, again, like I think you and I were sharing this week, that it's not just the way he did Ephesians, but he's also doing Colossians in a similar way, which we're going to study later this year. And then in some ways, Galatians.
Right.
But it kind of reminds me, when I first started speaking as a preacher or pastor of a church, I quickly learned that a pastor generally has one message that they say in a variety of ways.
Right.
And so I think that's what you hear from Paul, is
right.
that you really do get a sense of who he is and how he's trying to train these new and early believers.
And you think about, these are all letters to believers at churches, or
right.
with Galatians, the region, church in the region. It's interesting to think about, and I did that this morning, think about Mark's gospel, the questions that were happening, that were coming to Paul, or the circumstance that were having that inspired Paul to say what he said. And if you take this One Thing series that we talked about, there was obviously something he saw that was distracting them, or there was something that they had asked about, how do we live out this Christ life? How do we live? And he says, well, the easiest way to do it is to focus on one thing. Right. And just seeing how he relates to each of those churches and answers their questions. And we'll never know exactly what was asked or how he responds to the exact situation. But it is intriguing to think about those things and think about how that applies to our life also.
Right. And one of the things that I picked up on from, I think it was the message 2 weeks ago, is just we need to understand that as the church continues to evolve in different cultures, that the nature of that church needs to evolve with it.
Right.
I think for a long time the church was so afraid of being accused, and even if it was accusing itself, of being like the world,
right.
that we didn't understand what it was like to be in the world.
Right.
And so if we can kind of distinguish that as we study Paul and these letters to churches, and understand that our calling is to be in the world, but not just to be of the world or like the world. And so I think that's what I think that's the reason. One of the things that motivates me in what I do, I get excited about that, trying to see the shifts. And I know in student ministry you see that, whether it's the things that they have access to that they didn't maybe even a generation ago, or maybe even last year.
Right.
But anyways, that's, I think, one of the takeaways for me from that was this whole idea of constantly working and striving to evolve, to be relevant into a world so that they really do hear the gospel.
Well, and when you talk about being in the world and not of the world, being that light is the idea of loving first. Because typically the world doesn't love first.
Right.
You can see that in the tweets that went out last night from the State of the Union address, the number of people that did not respond love first.
Wait, I thought there was a basketball game on last night.
Well, I only knew that all the three main channels were taken up by the president. So, I remember that as a kid when we only had three channels. For those of you who don't know about that, Google it. That was a reference from Sunday's conversation.
Yeah.
Just so you know. But yeah, I mean, just watching the tweets come out on Twitter, the world doesn't respond love first. And that's what we're called to. And we slip into that so easily that we don't respond love first.
It's the second time that I've used the words love first in this series.
Mm-hmm.
And that's intentional. But I did pick up on it from the last time I mentioned it until this week. I want to make sure that we understand the language behind love first. And so I rephrased it the way that we did when we taught that series, that we at First Baptist Church, we want to be the first responders of God's love to the world. And so in order to do that, we have to make adjustments in our life so that our mind or emotions or feelings or opinions don't automatically go into judgment mode rather than a place where we can respond appropriately with God's love.
And I think that's, once you get to doing that on a regular basis, or even when you try to approach that way, your outlook on life is so much more positive.
Oh, true. And I think also it goes along with what we've talked about before, that's where you're going to make mistakes. And that's where you're going to also potentially be criticized.
Right.
But that would be, when you look at the life of Jesus, I mean, those are the things that you'd say he was criticized for. When he was doing something out of love or compassion, and the people who were just a part of the church just didn't understand that.
When you think about like eternal destiny and all that kind of thing, I think I'd rather get to seeing God and God say, why did you love them first instead of judge them first? I mean, I'd rather somebody get mad at me here and God say, why did you choose to love them first? Well, I kind of thought, that's what you were leaning towards there.
And there's a T-shirt or idea or two in that.
That's
so
true.
Thank you for distracting me with that.
Yes. But that goes into one of the things that stuck out during the conversation to me was you talking about being imitators of God. And it was just kind of, you caught it as you were moving to the next thing. But so often, how we live our life represents Christ to the world. And if we're not imitating God, then we're not giving a good picture of what God's kingdom is, of who God is, of God's love for us. And that needs to be at the forefront of our mind each day, that we're representing God, and how do we live that out each day? And if you're living in love, that's pretty valid.
Yes, and Paul used those words, and I think for us, particularly when you look at it on a daily basis, that for us, it's placing a perspective in our life, knowing we cannot attain that, but it's something that we strive for. And Paul uses a lot of those words in the way that he talks about striving and athletes and trying to reach a certain place and a certain thing. And I think that's where this comes in for us, is that we can't just be happy with the way we are or the way things are, but I believe that we ought to wake up asking God for that one thing, and through that one thing we imitate God in the world.
Right. I told you this in this sidebar, of course, that one of the first things I remember from being in youth ministry, not a youth ministry, but in youth ministry, was an illustration where the youth minister brought out potatoes and had us write down the Ephesians passage on it and said, I'm a tater, be an imitator of God. And that's funny, and it made me laugh. But that just sitting on your end table, your dresser rotting away, it is a visual reminder of how we imitate God. So we need those visual reminders in our life of how we live out that imitation of God also. And when you focus on one thing, it makes it a lot easier.
And I'm trying to dial in a lot of thoughts right now just because you said that.
Yeah, I eventually had to throw that tater away, which was a bad use of a tater.
So glad that you did.
When you talk about the things that distract us, it's obviously sin that does it, because it's getting between our relationship with God. And I told you earlier, it reminded me of the cycle in Judges, that their sin was idolatry. And that's anything we do that doesn't focus on God is idolatry. And that's what sin is in our life. And we have to find a way to put that away, to move past that. But it only comes through help from God and then help from your community.
Right. There's forms of accountability to that. I think, again, if you go back and rewind that, it starts with what we're hoping to attain.
Right.
So in trying to attain that, just like a lot of things in our life experience, there are certain things that are going to detract from that, and so you want to remove those. And I think you're right. You start with the sin in your life, the things that you know are going to be things that are going to separate you from God in your relationship. And so when we start to deal with those, then deal appropriately with those and try to live in true repentance of those sins, then comes in just some of those habits that keep us, that sometimes, like I was sharing Sunday, that I really just allowed to keep going in my life, but that really ought to be seen as something that trips others up and ought to be removed from my life, and trips me up as well in my own faith life.
We were talking about the whole conversation Sunday, we being Stacy and I, and about how the repetitive nature of one thing helps you understand the importance of it being one thing in your life. Like for this year, that it does seem like we talk about what that one thing is, and you never answer it for us because it's individual to each one of us. But that repetitive nature needs to be in our life every day, and that will help us better focus on Christ and what He has for us.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, because it's probably an appropriate time now that the series is over to say that was a difficult series to go from week to week.
Right.
But I think you described it. The difficulty was, I think we still tend to have that or want people to tell us what the one thing is. And so, and I go back, and that's kind of how I started, that there was this general assumption that we all knew. As believers, we all knew what the one thing was. And there are certain things that are central to our faith. But the things that we do as believers and followers and disciples of Jesus, with the unique expressions that God gives us and the unique opportunities that we have through our path, we need to be aware of that one thing in our life. And then two, those things, in terms of that process, they began to evolve into other things. But yeah, it was once I got into it, the language was difficult.
Right.
The text was really good, and hopefully we got kind of absorbed in that chapter of Ephesians, and it's a good reflection of the whole book there, or letter. So hopefully I didn't trip us up too much in that, but a good landing place for sure.
I'm not a movie person, but you were pretty much a modern day Curly for us from City Slickers, right? Isn't that his name, Curly?
Okay,
he talked about
City
one
Slickers.
thing.
You'll have to IMDb that.
Yeah.
And so
for those of you who don't know, Google it.
Yeah, but it's an old movie. It was one of the things that came up. As far as the reading I was doing on this, it was influenced by a book that was influenced by a series. I wanted to do this to kind of bring focus to the year.
Right.
When I Googled it, I found this book. And so one of the examples in there was a clip from City Slickers with Curly. And then the other part that I picked up that I really liked was that domino effect of how one thing, and that's what I guess what we're trying to say is that if you can discover that one thing, then it does create an effect for another thing.
Right.
And then ultimately it makes something big with that momentum. But yeah, that's I did watch that clip.
I love that.
And figured that most people, I think it was from the 90s, right at the turn of the century anyway.
It was in the 1900s.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Did you expect to get it? Did you have anybody say anything, or did you get to expect any comments? Did you expect to get any comments? There we go. Strike that. Reverse it. About the multitasking that you did the first conversation, talking about we can't multitask. That came around with computers.
No.
Did you expect to get anybody to say anything?
During this series, I was really challenged. I challenged myself on the introductions that I used, and it's interesting how the way people's minds work. You start a discussion like that and then lead it to a certain place, but those things are memorable,
right.
And those are the things that people will talk to you about. And so, no one asked me about that one, but I did have a conversation or two about sarcasm.
That doesn't surprise me. I figured someone would come and say, I can walk and chew gum at the same time, and then they'd trip.
Yeah.
I mean, that would have been perfect.
Yeah, I had to be careful with those examples, because that is one of the examples of what people would say are multitasking.
Right.
But that whole reading in that section was very interesting. And what it does for us spiritually in our faith life is say that you've got to focus. There ought to be some kind of focus in your life. I mean, we talk in Faith Life that we have a tendency to compartmentalize, which brings about spreading our faith, where it's kind of in boxes, and we pull the box out that we need at a certain time. And even with that, you get the idea that we have this inability to focus. So if you begin with the end in mind, and Sharon reminded me of those principles that continue to ooze out of my life of quotes and things. But if you begin with the end in mind, and Paul says, be an imitator of God, and you're going, oh, can't do that. Well, you can't check out on that. You have to begin to work your way backwards and start seeing how it is you become and pattern your life, whether it's disciplines or experiences that you can create for yourself, which, coming up with, we've been doing some calendar planning this week for Lent and the Lenten season. You look at those different things and opportunities that we have to really grow and develop our faith to make us more like Christ and to make us imitators of God in the world.
And this idea of focusing isn't unique to us. Like, people outside the walls of the church are figuring this out. We talk in our own staff meetings, we do 4 disciplines of execution, and it talks about having one goal that helps meet what you're doing as a whole each week. And then even our 6x6, focusing on one thing, or 6 goals over 6 weeks, and you focus in on one thing and get it done. I mean, when you focus, you're more productive, and that's the same thing with our spiritual lives.
It makes it very easy conversation and very easy to evaluate, because that way you know whether or not you're hitting the mark every time.
I know this was a total unexpected. Go watch the end of the live stream from last Sunday. It wasn't planned or anything like that. It just kind of evolved and happened. But what better perfect transition from one thing to living 360 than having a student who comes to Christ, and you get to tell that story Sunday morning of how Lisa got to share with her Christ's love and got to pray with her, and then you bring her down front Sunday morning, and then all the people get up there with her that have prayed for her, have been in their life, have helped pour into that. Such a cool picture and a transition that naturally happened that we weren't expecting.
It was a great day, and that, even if you just consider that one thing, that was a great day. And Lisa had already told me about that. She had a chance to talk to Shelby earlier that morning during the Bible study hour, and she completely understood, and she made it very clear that morning through prayer. And Lisa was able to walk her through that. And when we were talking, I can't remember exactly how I had framed the landing on Sunday, but it wasn't far from that.
Oh, really?
And so, and I just told Lisa, I said, I'm not sure how this is going to come out, but I want the church to celebrate what God's doing and see it and get a picture of that too. And good picture, by the way.
And it leads in, thanks. And it leads in perfectly to Living 360,
Right.
The next series where we talk about being disciple makers.
Right. This next series is, first of all, it's probably maybe of all the things that I've done here, one of the things that's nearest and dearest to my heart. Because when I think about the one thing in my life over a long span of time in my ministry, I would say discipling is that one thing. And so there was a longer period of time between the start of the year and Ash Wednesday. And so I wanted to kind of bring a focus to this season for us and really move into some disciplines of faith. And so we're going to talk about this. It's called Living 360. It's really centers on 2 Timothy 2:2, which is one of my favorite verses in Scripture. And it's a relationship between Paul and Timothy and how they lived life together. We also see it in the life of Jesus and his disciples and the calling, and their calling, and then ultimately them moving into being and establishing the church. So it's going to be a really good series for us on a 4-week study, and we get started this Sunday.
Cool. So if you don't have a place to go to worship, come here Sunday morning, 213 East 3rd Street. If you haven't been in a while, come. If you've been here last Sunday, come.
Yeah, it's going to be a really good series, and hope that you'll join us. As we sign off this morning, we want to encourage you to subscribe to our podcast. It helps us to know that people are listening on a regular basis, and so that way Teek and I can make ourselves get up and get in here every Wednesday morning to share some time with you. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, we'd encourage you to subscribe there also, and let us know that you're a part of our community by doing that. So we do look forward to seeing you Sunday, and have a great week.
See ya.